I think they're probably right. So good morning again, and thank you for the people who allow us to gather here, to the ancestors and the unborn and those stewards of the land that walk the land today. We know how critical it is for us to reconnect with our lands and to be in the places where we feel most comfort. So I'm going to speak to you a little bit about some of the work I've actually been doing at home. And for those who may have heard me speak in my historic life, I've been a director of education, I've been a director of health, I've been a director responsible for traditional knowledge and language at home. But for the past better part of over a dozen years or so, my job has really been responsibility for governance transition. And what that means is really thinking about what does self-government mean to the nation and how are we going to get there. So some of you may be participants in that thing called the treaty process. Well, we participate, but it's really just to get some resources, because we know how scarce it is to get resources to do governance work. So we've been using those resources to do nation rebuilding, to do community development. We may never sign a final treaty, and we probably won't if the mandates don't change, but it's like trying the car before you buy it sort of a thing. So we know we're going to be doing that, and we just hope we can get some resale value at the end, because that loan is getting pretty big. So I'm going to share a quick PowerPoint session with you, and then we're actually going to do some roll up your sleeves and a little bit of work, so bear with us. Click. Hey, it worked. I'm always amazed when these little things make things happen. Wow, look at that. That's British Columbia, a very big province, as we know, and it's a very diverse province. We know that British Columbia actually has 7 of the 11 Indigenous language families of Canada. 7 of the 11 Indigenous language families housed right here in BC. And if any of you travel across Canada, you know why, because as soon as you leave BC, those mountains, it's pretty flat, right? So there weren't a lot of barriers to keep people apart from each other. But we understand the geography of BC, huge mountains, big lakes, massive rivers. We didn't go where we didn't go because we didn't have to go there. So where we lived, where we were born, and many of us actually have creation stories that set us in our place. We have this diversity, and inside this diversity of those mother languages, those language families, there's many dialects that fall from them. My language, however, it's an isolate language. It's related to no other language in the whole world. So when it goes, it's gone. And so that's really, really an anxious-making thing for us. We get a lot of anxiety when we think about the fragile state of our language, especially when we think about how many people speak it. Very few people are actually fluent in our language now. And so it's really a critical thing for us. How are we going to make sure that we keep this language? So the past decade or two, we've been documenting everything we can, videotaping everything we can on the language and also on our traditional cultural activities, our traditional ecological knowledge, the knowledge that the language contains, because we understand that the words we use in our traditional languages are not just the same thing as like a cup. We would have a word to talk about a cup that's made of something or something. So the words become far more descriptive and become far more intimate when we really understand them. We also in British Columbia have this vision statement. So we have this vision that was given to us back in the year, I think it was 2006, 2005, 6, when the transformative change work was done here in BC. And even though the whole accord kind of didn't get implemented, this work we're doing right now, this health transfer work and the health transformation work, was that promise back then. So that was 2006, and here it is almost 2016. 10 years just to get this to the place where we can actually make some changes. So I giggle when we had this vision statement given to us by the chiefs and all of the politicians back in the year 2006 or so, because they actually put a plan underneath this vision. And how many of you were around back then and saw that 2006 initial plan? How many? Come on, I know a few of you have been around this world for a while. I've seen a few of you. I actually said to myself, we're never going to see any movement in those indicators that they put in front of us. We're never going to see change in the actual health status of our people. Okay, $5. Oh, it's 20 here. And I'll be rich by the time I leave. Hey. If it's a good song, I might just have to start dancing to it though. So. This vision statement is grand, it's huge, and it must have been a good thing because the chiefs all put it in front of us back then. In my own nation, we have a vision statement. It also talks about being healthy. It talks about being self-sufficient. It talks about being self-governing. It talks about those things. And we can see ourselves in this vision statement. We can see it, but what does it really mean? When I come up here, the cultures up here are very different. I was in Parksville last week on the island. The cultures over there are different. And over in my neck of the woods, next to the Rocky Mountains in the southeast corner of the province, the culture again is very different. We're beads and feathers kind of people that live in teepees, right? So it's very different when we come up here or we go further to the coast. So the diversity of British Columbia is, of course, the same as the diversity of those languages, the same as the diversity of our land. We are very diverse, but we all want to be healthy. We all want to be self-determined. We all want to be vibrant. Vibrant? What does vibrant even mean, for crying out loud? Must have meant something really important at the time. But what does it mean to us now? Does this mean the same thing it did 10 years ago, or did we know what it meant 10 years ago? And in fact, I had somebody from one of the mainstream health folk say to me, oh, we're really interested when it comes time for you guys to measure your vibrancy. Because out here in the big world, we don't think you can measure something like vibrancy. We don't know how to do that. That's why they always draw back to looking at things like death. They can measure death. Oh yeah, dead. One, you got that. But how do you actually measure something live, living? How is it? It's challenging. When we go back to our languages, we actually have words that describe a developing human at different stages. So you're not just a baby. You're a dependent baby, then you're a little bit... So we actually talk about the developing person in a different way than we do in the outside world. So again, we've got to look at this from our own place, from our own perspective as Indigenous people in BC. Another map, another map, another map. How many maps are there in BC? Well, the lines on the other one were really tiny, thin lines. And I don't know about you, but I don't know about any tiny little thin line around my territory. I've never seen it, never tripped over it. You know? And I've had people in the neighboring tribes and people in mainstream talk about overlapping territory. And I giggle and I say, I've never seen two mountains stacked on top of each other. I've never seen overlapping territory, but I have heard about and seen overlapping people. And in my neck of the woods, that's how we got the Shenanigans and the Okanahas and how the nations, the Chippewa Nation, the Siouxs Nation, the Dunaka Nation, historically, how we traded with each other. Sometimes we fought when we scarce resources, but when there were rich times, when things were going okay, we talked with each other, we related to each other, we traded with each other. We actually traded men and women with each other, and that's how we kept our blood strong. That's how we actually accessed different resources, etc., etc. So we had ways of relating that were very different. This map actually came from the early child development work from the Human Early Learning Partnership. Help! I thought, oh my gosh, if you're going to do, please don't call it help. These acronyms we put in front of us really drive us to a particular way of thinking. And the whole work behind this map was looking in kindergarten classrooms around British Columbia to find the levels of vulnerability of First Nations children. Vulnerability. Here we go again. Is the cup half empty? My cup's never half empty. There's always something in it, right? Always something there. Even if there's nothing you can see, there's air in there, people. And when air is scarce, I can use that air. That'll keep you alive for a little longer. So this map is actually based on when little children report themselves as being from a particular linguistic group. Sad to say, down in my corner, see it's all gray down there? Not one child in the kindergarten classrooms where the teachers did this assessment, because this is a teacher-driven assessment in each kindergarten classroom where they ask these children these things. Not one of them said that they had Dunaka language. Not one of them said they were Dunaka. Well, I said, okay, I'll be okay with that for now, because we have schools that have most of the Dunaka kids in them, in our communities. Most of the kids go to kindergarten in our schools. But I know there are mainstream Dunaka kids in the mainstream classes. So that's a scary thing to me. When our children don't know themselves, don't stand up and recognize themselves. And even if it's the language they haven't got, they should still have and know who they are. One of the factors of being well, globally, one of the things that's acknowledged as making you feel well is belonging, is having a sense of belonging to something. So we've got some work to do with respect to ensuring that we, as Indigenous people, make sure that our children know who they are, know who our neighbors are, and celebrate those things again. In fact, I firmly believe in my heart that recognition will not come from the crown. Recognition as Indigenous people comes from us looking at each other and reminding ourselves of who we are and our history in our ancestral homelands. Because if we can't recognize each other and give each other recognition and start the process of reconciliation, how do we expect them to ever do it? They weren't here before. They can't recognize us. They can see us who we are now. But that deeper recognition and that reconciliation has got to be based on us as Indigenous people recognizing ourselves again and really stopping to fight about these little lines on the map and starting to celebrate what those histories really were. Those lines were not deeply carved in the maps. The other thing I came to know when we were doing our nation rebuilding work, I come across these mainstream theories and then I go, oh, that's what they mean. I'm not an academic. I grew up with grandmas, around community that way. I didn't go to, I've got enough school to actually sit and talk. A couple years of business admin, but I read all the theology books, read sociology, psychology, all of these things to understand these people, right? And I came to know when I was the director of health that there was this thing called determinants of health. And I'm like, okay, determine my health. Let me think about this a while. At the same time, as I say, I grew up with grandmothers. I grew up in that place, so I had this broad understanding of what wellness was. But health was a different thing. And when I came to know about health, I'm like, that really isn't in the same line necessarily as wellness. Because as health is described in the outside world, it's kind of like an absence or presence of disease. Right? But wellness for us is a much more holistic, a much more comprehensive thing. And in fact, I know people in my own nation, in my own family, who have disease, but are very well people. And you can say, how can that be? Because they recognize that that might be a physical disability they have or a physical thing going on. But because their spirit and their emotional self and the other parts of themselves are so strong that that physical disability doesn't mean a heck of a lot. And so they can deal with the pain or they can deal with whatever. So the determinants really came to know that there were different things like factors. There were factors that relate to well-being, okay? And you see what just fell out of those letters there, or fell out of that little statement there, that many factors combine together to affect the health. Chief fell out of there, and I was doing that time, holy cow, look at that, it's right there and that. Because at home, everybody thinks that's a chief's job. Chief's gonna, chief, counsel, you gotta make us well. Health director, make me well. Somebody make me well. No, it's not gonna happen. I gotta make me well. Yes, the chief's got to create and help create an environment, the council members, the health director, everybody, the environment. But we also came to know that whether people are healthy or not is determined by their circumstances, behavior, and environment. So the determinants of health, and I'm going to use the concept of determinants of wellness here, because it's beyond the absence or presence of disease. We're actually talking about our own understanding of wellness here. Include social and economic environment, physical environment, individual characteristics, and behaviors. Okay? So whether or not we're well has to do with how we behave throughout life, what our environment is like. I grew up in a really chaotic home, big time chaos, okay? Alcoholic father, many children, probably some of the same way many of you grew up. Sometimes there were guns involved, sometimes we were getting kicked out in the middle of the night, having to find our way to some next house in a snowstorm. Bet you've been there, eh? My granddaughter has not had any adventures when I can compare it to my early life. She does nothing, a calm girl, a few videos here and there. So we know that our early lives were really chaotic, and we don't see the same thing in our children today, thank goodness. Because the doctors have proven that early chaos, early trauma in a developing child or the developing fetus will result in inflammatory disease later in life. They made the direct connection, people. If your baby is growing up in an environment of trauma, that can be neglect, that can be abuse, that can just be chaos, be all kinds of things that you're going to have disease later in life. When I look at my own community, the levels of heart disease, which is an inflammatory disease, the levels of arthritis are unbelievable. In my own family, in the seven of us as brothers and sisters, we can point to the ones who've got the most inflammatory disease and who had the most trauma as children. It's like almost like direct lines. So it's like, okay, we also have in our culture, in our customs, stories that tell us how to behave when we're pregnant, how to behave when you're even thinking about becoming pregnant, men and women. So we knew these things. In fact, we had stories that said, if you do this, you'll have a shaky leg baby, you'll have a scatterhead baby. The words we had, the terms we had were not about being attention deficit hyperactive disorder. No, but we knew that you had to have good things to get good things out the other end. So we knew these things. We knew these things long before they called them the determinants of wellness. Okay? So what we've been doing at home really, when we boil it down, is talking about community development and nation rebuilding. Community-driven, nation-based. The communities is where the action is where the people is. But our language is bigger than any community. Our broader territory and our inherent right is bigger than any community. So we acknowledge we have to have both community development and nation rebuilding going on, which is difficult because we don't get any resources for governance. We just get resources to do program stuff. So we got to get together and figure out how do we actually change the relationships with government so we can deal with things a little differently. So again, the determinants of wellness, okay, how does it relate to us? To a large extent, factors of where we live, the state of our environment, our genetics, our income and education levels, and our relationships with family and friends have considerable impacts on health. Considerable. The other things, access to health services, minimal. So here we've taken over the First Nations Health Authority. Yeah! What can we actually do? Minimal impact on our well-being unless we change a whole bunch of other things. We can improve access to services. We can improve the cultural base of those services. We can do all kinds of stuff. We can drive people to the services. But whether or not that's going to change their behavior, whether or not that's going to change the environments at home in our own communities, etc., I don't know. So we've got to think broader than that. We've got to think really broad because in fact, you know what we are? In the eyes of the outside world, we're problems. We've always been problems. The Indian problem. How do you get rid of the problem? Well, they tried genocide, they tried a few other things. We're still here. We're not problems. In fact, we're solutions. And the more we actually share with the public agencies, the more they realize, you guys are solutions. You really do know how to do things. And in fact, if they would let us reclaim our families and go back to the way we used to be instead of the status Indian thing, we'd probably be far better off. So leaders, there is a real big job in front of us. It's not about tweaking the health system. It's actually about creating a new relationship. Oh, did I say that? Sorry. A different relationship with the province and the federal government. Because we've got to change the environment. We've got to change the way we actually relate before we can change other things. So this other thing down here, Indigenous people, the right to self-determination is the core to addressing problems of land, culture, and marginalization. Here we go again. Problems. I don't know who writes this stuff. But that's the way they think about it. So we've got to put something different in front of them. At home, we've acknowledged we've got two agendas again, community and nation-based, okay? One of them is really about governance. Governance, that's our leaders' work, that's the chief's work, the council work, etc. That's to set the long-term vision. That's to make sure that we have a good, clear picture of where we're going to go. It's basically, they want to know where we're going. You need to start creating that vision and the excitement about where we're going. We got to stop actually talking about problems in our communities and start talking about the wealth we have in our communities. And I'm not talking about money, even though some of us have that. I'm talking about the cultural wealth that's there. Because that's what's going to see us through to the end. A dollar is a dollar is a dollar. My nation's vision speaks to self-sufficiency. And I have an auntie who's 93, excuse me, my mom's 83. Auntie's 93, and she said, Gwen, I remember self-sufficiency. When I was a little girl, we were self-sufficient. If we can remember the taste, we can rebuild the recipe. I'm like, I'm with you, Auntie. The other thing is government. And that's kind of where we've been focused for the longest time. They've pushed us to the government place. And in fact, as a subordinate government, administering programs and services, but not being able to set policy. So that's the difference with the health authority work. We can set policy. We took over the policy reins, not just the dollars, but the policy reins, so we can do differently. We have a term at home we use in relation to our work around fetal alcohol syndrome, and that's try differently, not harder. Even if you're banging your head off the wall, there's probably a softer wall somewhere, so try it. So the short-term plans in government need to be attached to that long-term vision. They've got to be attached to it. They've got to be there to move you along. But right now, some of our visions are over here, and then we do this busy work plans over here for somebody else. For somebody else. We usually have to plan for outside folk, and we forget it's really about us. So the governance work, the setting the strategic vision, and then the government work, like FNHA, they are one of our government institutions, is to actually carry out the work in accordance with that strategic direction that's been given. So it's a challenge, real challenge for us. We've got this understanding of wellness from the First Nations perspective that includes environmental, social, and economic and cultural wellness. We've got these things called the determinants of well-being. Culture is one of those determinants. Culture, in my mind, is the most important one for us to initially focus on, because that's where our wellness will be rediscovered. As the more we look back to who we are and rediscover ourselves, The more we unpack our languages again, the more we discover what wellness really means, and the way we have, the tools we have in our own histories and our own ways of doing to achieve that. Physical environment, social support networks, those are the things that they describe in categories of what the determinants are. So if you think about something like your social support network, aunties, uncles, grandparents, your clan, your house, etc. Those were our social support networks. In fact, we were socioeconomic societies. So the social group was part of the economic group as well. It wasn't a separate thing where the people were over here and the economy was over here. We were a social economy as Indigenous people. So we've got to go back to that place where we look towards all of these determinants as being addressed in our planning work. A comprehensive plan for our nation rebuilding in our communities. Not somebody else's plan. We want to look at the social and economic environment, the physical environment, and we also need to acknowledge what the characteristics of our people are right now. We know back home, we don't have a lot of trust. Not a lot of trust. Don't trust the cat, don't trust the dog, don't trust the chief. I don't trust myself most of the time. We don't do a lot of trust. Our history hasn't led us there. But when we start digging deeper into our cultural system, digging deeper, that's where we start to rediscover trust again. I met a Maasai guy, a Kenyan government person last year, a year before, and he said, you know, I like to know that when I'm at home, I can fall backward and there'll be 10 Maasai to stand there and hold me up before I hit the ground. I said, yeah, it used to be like that in the Tanaka territory too. Now there'll be 10 around me, one might try to catch me, two might say, oh, I wonder if she got anything good when I'm on the ground. Two might say, I wonder how she got there. Somebody might say, we should pick her up. Somebody might say it's her own problem. We've got all of these different ways and different opinions and different beliefs and different levels of well-being in our community. We've got to all have a common focus, all believe in that focus as a vision, and really be mobilized to make it there. So we can't do this on our own. We shouldn't be doing this on our own. You want to know what? There's billions of resources go dollar. When they say billions of dollars in Indian resources, it's like, excuse me, how many actually get to our table? For the billions of dollars that get out of let on our treasury board, how many actually hit our table? I see a heck of a lot of bureaucracy between there and here. So how do we deal with that ourselves? Well, we've even got our own bureaucracy, people. And believe it or not, we've got the First Nations Education Steering Committee, the First Nations Fisheries Council, the Education... Oh, heck, we've got a whole bunch of people here. In the room, we've got the First Nations Health Council, First Nations Health Authority. But we know we have to bring into our room, into your room, into your plans, all of these other institutions in order to actually affect them. How do we ensure that we're moving holistically? How do we move forward in a good way? How do we make sure? Well, guess what? In my work in nation rebuilding at home, we actually confirmed that the most critical institution to fix is education, okay? That's where we grow the children. That's where we teach them things. And as long as what they call pedagogy, however you want to say it, that really means the way you think and the way you learn, okay? That's really about it. And as long as we're using the non-Indigenous way, the non-Tanaka way, we're not going to get strong, healthy Tanaka people again. Hey! Education. And we've got to wrap our resources around those institutions. Why did the school close at 4 o'clock? What? Why? We're still paying for heat, we're still paying for whatever. We've got to do differently, okay? Some communities have no health center, but they've got a beautiful school. Well, people, let's think differently. They're the ones who said you need this building and that building and the other building. We do differently, let's do differently. So how are we going to organize all of these different organizations to support community-driven, nation-based plans? Well, there's been some strategies starting to be born. I looked at the Health Authority mission and I'm going, okay, I see what they're trying to do here. They're trying to support families on their own journeys of wellness. They're not trying to fix us. They're trying to do what we said, create the right space, create the right environment, do anything they can do. But really it's about us as individuals with our own personal beliefs and our personal characteristics, etc., going to walk forward and actually take up the challenge of wellness. Come forward and get your Fitbit, eh? We also have the Schools Association mission. Well, guess what? They're also talking about collaboration with schools, First Nations schools. They're looking at self-governing First Nations communities. So they're saying they're going to work with you. So how do we actually make that happen? That's for us to figure out over the next little while. How do we restructure our own Indigenous, our own First Nations institutions to be a First Nations public service? That's our challenge over the next little while. We also have these resource-based groups. Fisheries Council, Action Plan. Hey, looking at common good, well-being of communities. I see a common thread in almost every mission or vision statement of these provincial organizations. And it's about Indigenous well-being, First Nations well-being, community well-being. So if that's what we're really talking about, then we've got to figure out a different business case, because it's not happening the way we're currently structured. That's part of what we're talking about here in moving forward, and part of what Grand Chief Doug Kelly will speak about over the next while. How do we actually take a strategic approach to this? How do we actually move ourselves all together in a good way? Because the end result should be strong, healthy people. The end result should be those healthy, self-determining, vibrant BC First Nations children, families, and communities. So we want to build healthy, strong families. We don't want to get rid of problems. So how do we do that? Appreciative inquiry is a thing we use at home. If you've never heard of that term, look it up. All it really means is looking for the good. It's actually a traditional way of doing things for us. We didn't go looking for the ugliness in the world. We didn't go saying, oh, Mother Nature, what did you do here? Oh, that leaf is crooked. No. In fact, those crooked leaves become part of my art projects. I look and see beauty in almost everything because that's what we were taught to do. So how do we get back there? How do we coordinate ourselves so we're not competing against each other? So that we're actually coordinating resources and investments in community well-being. That's really a challenge. I see awesome work taking shape out there. How many of you have got comprehensive community plans in place? Or at least starting them? How many? I see some heads nodding. There are a few, I know there are. In fact, I've seen some of the plans. Beautiful. Makes my heart happy because they actually talk about wellness, a lot of these plans. They're not talking about getting rid of disease. They're talking about bringing back culture, bringing back fish camps. They're talking about taking the boys out hunting again. They're talking about doing the things that make us well and bringing our culture along with us. This is an example of one of those plans from the Penticton Indian Band. The table of contents, page only, because the plan is 100 and some pages long. 103, I think the last chapter goes to, or something like that. Chief Jonathan Kruger says that the plan was built for the people, by the people, that a community plan is not something new to our people, that this way of planning is how they used to do things. Sitting together, talking about them. I know in my own nation, we had a duck chief, a deer chief, a camp chief, a war chief. We had men and women's societies. We had a well-oiled machine when it came to planning. Surveillance, research, you're darn right. That duck chief, he had to know where the ducks were, where the eggs were, how many there were, and he would let a policy out. How many we could take, where we could take. So people, we have these functions historically. They're just different now. They're just different. We've got to rediscover where they were, how they were, and re-energize them. So their main movement, their whole device to move them forward only has that many sections in it. Culture and language was right up front. Then governance following, because governance is how you're going to organize and orchestrate yourself to achieve those other things. Land and resources is right under that. We know how critical that is to our well-being. Then the community services, administration, finance, and economic development. The other thing is looking at economic development. Not just creating economic development to beg and borrow the white man's dollar, but to actually look at economics as an internal thing again. The internal economy, building our own houses, creating our own food security in our own ways again. We can do those things, and in fact, I challenged a bureaucrat one time and said, why do you give us welfare? Our people don't like that. We don't like the social support network or the social safety net hammock kind of concept. In fact, we would like to be out there working. If you gave us the resources to shift to a workforce instead of a welfare, we would have people working and feeling good about themselves. We have potholes that need filling, we've got fish that need catching, we've got deer that need hunting, we've got all kinds of stuff to do. Not that they would call a quote-unquote job, but a lot of work that needs doing. So let's think differently on how we get things done. Governance is very important. We've got to all focus in on that, but not, again, at the expense of the other things that are happening. We've got to have governance, we've got to have community planning work go on. Both have to happen, coordinated. So community development and nation rebuilding. I made a presentation to the Liberal Caucus when Campbell was still in place, and I sabotaged them basically. They were doing a little thing in our territory, and I actually snuck into the meal place where they were having their lunch and set up a PowerPoint when they were out watching us do dancing on the deck. You know, they wanted beads and feathers, we gave them that, but then they got an hour of Gwen when they came to sit down for lunch. And I had this thing done to the point where this PowerPoint had overlays of the provincial map, territorial maps. I had it so that we had nation-based representatives in the legislature. Huh? Campbell said to me, Gwen, I'd go for this, but you guys can't act as nations. It ain't gonna happen. I said, you give me 10 years. Hey, you want to know what our #1 directive is under the Health Authority brief? Community-driven, nation-based. The sooner we start acting as nations, the quicker we're going to change this relationship with the federal and provincial crown. In fact, right now, I'm being asked by federal bureaucrats in Ottawa, how do we do that, Gwen? How do we get to the nation-based relationships? Because that's what Justin wants. ABC, we're ahead of the game. So let's think about that. It's not nation, carrier nation, it's a big nation. However, lots of nations around, lots of communities, but fewer nations, yes. It gives us a more secure place to actually bring our governments forward. So community-driven, nation-based is really the way we're doing it. Nation rebuilding, not nation building. I've seen people talk about nation building. My elders stepped me a long time ago. What, you're building a new nation? No. Then you're going to rebuild another nation, starting from the creation story. From the creation story forward. Yes, that's what we're doing. And that's what we have been doing, spending all of that time. I've been the chair of finesse at one time, and I'm going, okay, I know we can do better. I know it's a challenge right now. I know some of the structures are well embedded in the way we do business, but we haven't been getting what we need out of the structure. So let's change things a little bit, people. Leadership, you can do that work. Over the next 18 months, 15 months, 16 months, whatever it's going to be, we can together do this work. And when we do it together and we focus in on those children in the classrooms and understand that their success in those classrooms is dependent upon having good early child development. Early child development is one of the determinants of wellness, people. Early child development, isolated as being a very important factor in well-being. Education, yeah, that's what a school does, right? Food security, if those children in those classrooms were actually doing gardening, doing the things that they need to be doing to feed them, yes. Do you want to know how good you feel? Do you want to know how much your immune system gets built by actually touching the dirt? Eh? That's why Indians are so tough. Because we still lay in the dirt, we still play in the dirt, we still lay on the ground and camp, we do those things, right? They never get rid of us. Immune systems are tough. Income and employment assistance. Have you ever looked in a classroom and seen a kid there with his head down at lunchtime because all he's got in his lunch bucket is one piece of bannock and not even a piece of some jam to slide on that bread, right? We've seen that. So should we shame the parent, or should we actually, as a community, figure out how do we deal with this? How do we teach the children to feed and support each other in that classroom instead of going, okay, oh, that Charles only has a piece of bannock today. Oh, that dad must be poor. No, let's take that right out of the equation and do things differently the way we used to do it. Because you want to know what? In the work we do at the Health Council, we weren't a well-oiled machine initially. You want to know how we became it? By learning about each other as human beings, by sitting and eating together. Before every one of our business meetings, we actually have a wellness dinner where we talk about ourselves as our state of well-being. Mental, physical, emotional well-being, etc. So we can be at the right place at the right time. And if one of us isn't well, then we don't expect them to be at 100% of the table. We know that we have to support that person. That's what we need to get back to. Instead of being mean with each other, we need to do that lateral kindness work that's so critical. All of those things belong to the provincial government right now. The jurisdiction over all of those things is provincial jurisdiction. Now we get the federal government in between us and the good work that we need to do. And we're saying, how about we just look at some intergovernmental investment in our First Nations governments? So I've got Ottawa now positioned to say, okay, if you guys can get really good plans in BC and we can agree to some outcomes, we'll think about doing differently. We'll think about reducing the reporting. We'll think about having a different investment structure. And now the opportunities like it's never been, because this government is a new, fresh government, and the more ready we are to slide things in front of them, guess what? That's what's going to happen, okay? Because they haven't got any plans. So the quicker we are giving them the good plans, those are the plans that are going to be achieved. But the challenge is, how do we actually get to those good things? And how do we make sure we're not just looking at getting rid of problems and building on presence of positives? We need good information management systems and data systems. And I'll be talking a little bit about that later this afternoon, because in my work in governance, in peer to know, we've got this beautiful vision statement, but if we can't define it, we can't measure it, all it is a beautiful vision statement that looks good on a t-shirt or a poster, okay? It's meaningless. So we've got to take the time as Indigenous people in our own nations, to define what healthy is again, in our own terms, in ways that make sense to us. We've got to share what these higher level outcomes are. We've got to work together and say, okay, First Nations Schools Association, First Nations Education Steering Committee, what is it you're trying to do? And how do we align you with our plan? And then how do we actually take on the next one? How do we take on the next one? So we make sure we're aligning all of these different entities. Some of us forget that there is actually a provincial entity called the First Peoples Cultural Foundation. It's a provincial crown corporation that's supposed to be there to help us rejuvenate our languages. They do us very little with respect to helping to rejuvenate our languages because they're stuck in this bureaucracy. They're stuck in this thing. They want my nation to go through this big assessment every time we do a proposal. And I'm going, but all that's changed with respect to the Tenaka Nation is we've lost 2 more fluent speakers. And in probably doing this assessment, I'm going to lose 1 more because it's a huge thing. And I'm going, why do you do that to us as Indians? Why, as Indians, we got taught well, and we do worse sometimes within our own institutions. So we got to start again. How do we inform these institutions to do differently with us and for us? And looking at creating investments, people. Not grants, not program contributions, not a proposal to get $1 to then have to dance around, and then be told you didn't satisfy the reporting requirements, we're holding back next funding. All of this stuff is so goofy. It takes us backwards. It doesn't result in progress. I've been for the past 3 years now, pretty much, been visiting Ottawa fairly regularly. In fact, through this BC Data Governance Initiative, we've got them thinking differently now. They're ready to talk in terms of investment. So we've got the challenge in front of us, people. What are we going to invest in? My own nation, okay? Looking in this mirror. Who are we? Who are you, Ktunaxa? What's a Ktunaxa Smuknik? So we had to look at measuring our own wellness. In your packages, you'll see a little guide called Measuring Wellness. It's one of the products we had from our work last year in our BC First Nations Data Governance Initiative. Because we were doing this community planning and we were going, but we don't know what to measure. This guidebook goes along with our planning work. So it helps you to understand, and it was created by First Nations people, for First Nations people. The writer was Gwen, who does the community planning work with ANSI, so she made sure it matched up with that, but really worked with communities to move this forward. So we've now got a guide to help people understand. Because if you actually knew what goes on in Ottawa when they look at trying to measure First Nations well-being, when I learned about that, I went, OMG. They'll never know whether we're well or not. They'll always have Auditor General on their back. They'll always have trouble justifying their spending authorities because they can't define well-being for First Nations people. And how dare they even try to define well-being for us? So we've got to do this work ourselves. You've got to do this work yourself in your own community. It took us a couple of years to define our vision statement. It took us 2 years to even get the vision statement agreed to in the Tenaka Nation. Then another couple of years to define it in terms we could actually agree to. Some of those things, that the home is safe and secure, that was one of those things around physical environment. What do we need to have in the community? That the person practices healthy eating habits. We have to look at these things. How do we measure these things is the next challenge. We're not going to measure everything. We're going to measure 1 or 2 things in priority as we move forward. But we all agree that we're sharing this vision statement, this outcome, this high-level vision statement, and that it can reflect on us differently in each of our nations, in each of our cultures. In fact, it has to. It has to be different. Otherwise, we would end up with this pan-indigenous thing, this indigenization. Please don't indigenize me, okay? I like being Ktunaxa. So, I'm going to close this piece down here very soon, and we're going to move on to the next piece. This last little slide that unfolds is a really powerful message. Because in the work we've done at home in using appreciative inquiry, we've come to realize that the more we talk in positive terms, the more people in the community talk in positive terms. The more we talk about the good future and share what the good future is, the more people want to be part of it. Okay? It's a natural phenomenon. People want to be where they feel good, right? So let's work together to do this work together. Watch your words. I have a cousin, same age as me. Actually, I don't have her anymore. We lost her 1.5 years ago to an overdose in downtown Vancouver. She was a bright girl, brilliant, went to university, got awards, but in her family, she was never made to feel good. In fact, when we were little kids together, I'd hear her parents fighting. You think I wanted that kid? She's never been a problem to me. Okay? I never heard those things in my house. We had a lot of problems, like I said, guns, all kinds of stuff. But we never as children felt that we weren't wanted. Okay? Yeah, we had our issues, but she felt she wasn't wanted, was never good enough. She became her habits, her character. She ended up leaving us. Okay? So we really got to be cautious as we do this work. As leaders, watch how we talk, how we position ourselves. As mothers, how we position ourselves. As grandmothers, how we position ourselves. Because our destiny is right in front of us. So again, that vision that we have, healthy, self-determining, vibrant BC First Nations children, families, and communities. help me to understand what it means so that we as the Health Council can help our health authority to get ready to measure it. Because I've been dealing with the people that are going to be doing the reporting in the First Nations Health Authority, and they're going, we're not going to make people do what they used to have to do with Health Canada. Or we need to know what to do. We need to know how to report in a good way that actually allows us to measure the well-being we're trying to achieve. And if we do work together, we can actually create a different life for our children. So at home, that's basically that little baby. And that is a gift we give to the parents and to the family. There's a whole bunch of things that come with parent moccasins and some of the storybooks in the language, etc. And this little care card, a little introduction that says, hey, this is me, take me to gatherings, let me know my songs, my stories, teach me my culture, teach me my values, teach me my, because I'm yours. And in fact, in my culture, we don't own the children. We are stewards of the children. The Creator owns the children. And